Welcome to RICO 12, everybody. I'm Justin B., your host, and a child of an all-powerful, perfectly loving God, and an addict living in the miracle of recovery one day at a time. RICO 12 is an open to all addictions and afflictions organization dedicated to exploring the common threads of the differing manifestations of alcoholism, sharing tools and offering hope from those walking a similar path. So whether your thing is alcohol, drugs, sex, gambling, food, whatever, you are home here. We gather from diverse backgrounds, faiths, and locations to learn from and support one another. Our speakers come from various fellowships and experiences demonstrating the universal principles of recovery. RICO 12 is not allied or affiliated with any specific 12-step fellowship. This is RICO 12 speaker meeting number 416. I tried to short myself by 10. Thank you for joining us live or on the recording later. Today's speaker is Cameron F., who is a RICO 12 veteran. He was actually our second ever speaker way back in June of 2020 and has spoken several times since. You can find those and any of the other previous recordings on the RICO 12 podcast. We are continuing our 12-week series on each of the 12 steps of recovery this week, and Cameron will proceed with step 5 today, and I look forward to diving into this conversation here in a few minutes. But first, a few quick announcements. RICO 12 does offer a variety of recovery resources, including podcasts, social media communities. To explore more, visit RICO12.com. That's RECO12.com, like recovery12step.com. Or check the chat and the show notes for links. We're always looking for speakers to share on RICO 12. And the 12-week series, we've now got speakers for every step, but we will be looking for more speakers starting in May and moving forward. So if your higher power is moving on you to share, consider reaching out to me and we'll get it lined up. We are self-supporting, and your contributions help us continue this message. For information on how to support us financially, but more importantly, by word of mouth, the information is in the chat and the show notes and on the website at RICO12.com/support. Thank you this week to Joshua, Katerina, and Nigel for your generous donations. Your support, both financially and, like I said, by word of mouth, truly makes a difference. All right. Here's a little bit about our guest speaker after Cameron F., who is going to speak to us and inspire hope, meaning, worth, and growth in us. Cameron F. has been a member of Cocaine Anonymous since November 21st, 2003. As a Big Book sponsor, he has worked with all kinds of addicts from around the world. He facilitates a 12 Steps in 4 Hours workshop monthly and has carried the 12-step message of recovery to well over 16,000 suffering addicts over the past 22 years. His recovery message is, quote, "It only takes a day to learn the 12-step program and the rest of your life to practice it." He is currently the archivist for the Southern Ontario area of Cocaine Anonymous and the archive chair for CA World Services out of Phoenix, Arizona. Take it away, Cameron. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Justin. Actually, I'm the archivist for CA World Services. We have an archive chair, but thank you for those acknowledgments. It's been a while since I've been on here, and I kind of introduced myself in a number of ways. My favorite way to introduce myself is my name's Cameron. I'm a member of Cocaine Anonymous. I'm an alcoholic addict who doesn't drink or use. Sometimes if I'm having fun with the audience, I'll introduce myself as an intelligent agent, spearhead of God's ever-advancing creation. And as of late, I've been using, I am a God that shits. And I know that sounds really intense, but it really kind of brings forth the dichotomy of this profane earthly existence and marrying it with the sacred, which is the divine spark that dwells within each and every one of us. I have a lot of fun in just introducing oneself. You can have a lot of fun with your audiences. Just to recap, to bring us to this juncture of step 5, we know from our step 1, we come in to these rooms seeking a solution, regardless of what the addiction pattern is. And that step 1 proposition of powerlessness and unmanageability, the powerlessness being described and crystallized as to all the failed strategies that we employed to either curtail it, manage it, or stop it that failed to do that for us. And what's really great about that approach and identifying in that approach is it's a universal mechanism. All addicts, regardless of their addiction pattern, use the same strategies and fail at trying to maintain some kind of control or abstinent from what ails them. And then the second part of step 1 is the losing strategy, the unmanageability that's going on in my head, losing my serenity. I can't seem to manage that restless, irritable disposition, that boredom, that depression. And when I use, I go out on this losing streak pursuing my love of my addiction to the gates of insanity or death. I've buried 49 people to date now, Justin. I've buried 38 people to mostly alcohol death. Alcohol is still one of the most dangerous drugs out there. Kill you when you drink it, kill you when you detox from it. Benzos are bad too. In the acting out addictions like sex, love, fantasy, gambling, it usually either ends in suicide or murder. That's been my experience over 22 years. But 38 are dead from overdoses. 9 people committed suicide. They would not see our way of life. They didn't know how to live with it. They didn't know how to live without it, and they went insane, and they ended up taking their own lives. And suicide rates in the rooms today are 80 times higher than normal society. An untreated addict in abstinence without a program is 80 times more likely to commit suicide. And 2 people were murdered that I worked with. And that's a horrifying conclusion in step 1, because it's a realization nothing secular, nothing human, nothing psychological is going to stop me. I will drink and I will use again, and to do so is to die. Yet here I am 22 years later, able to easily control my desire to drink or use. And it's because I met someone who was armed with the facts and understood addiction and a generosity of spirit. And the first, he said, Cameron, you got to have the essentials in place if you want what I got, which is a power greater than myself. I said, what's that? He said, you got to be honest. You got to be willing. You got to be open-minded. I can do that. I'm out of options. I'm out of strategies. Throw me a frickin' bone. And then we took the step 2 proposition. He introduced me to where I'm going to find that power. I'm going to find the great reality deep down within me. It's a leap of faith in step 2, where I come to believe that there is a power at work because I see it working in Justin. Self-admitted addict for many years, doesn't do it anymore and claims a power greater than himself, restored him to sanity. I'm like Justin. Justin's like me. He doesn't do it anymore. I want what he has. And then the ability to be honest with myself and to search diligently within myself. And the promise is I can join all of you wonderful people on the broad highway. And then in step 3, I decide, okay, I know there's power out there. I want this power too. So I make a decision in step 3 that I'm going to fire that liar in my head. I'm going to employ God, and I'm going to listen to that direction. I'm going to try to apply these spiritual moral principles in all my affairs. And the promise being that if I do that, I will be able to connect to a power that lets me easily control my desire, drink, use, or act out. And then, of course, I realize I'm kind of blocked, so I do the step 4. I map out. And what I love the way Bill did steps 4 and 5, 6 and 7 and 8 and 9. The first step was step 4 to map it out. Step 5, we execute. Step 6, we map it out. Step 7, we execute. Step 8, we map it out. Step 9, we execute. So we look at our resentments, fears, and harms, and we tease out this moral inventory, these shortcomings, this bondage of self, and we begin to recognize certain things about ourselves that are impediments to us having a greater relationship with the one who's got all the power. And so that brings us to the step 5 proposition, where we do 3 things. We admit to ourselves, God, and another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. Now, having made the personal inventory, which we've done in step 4, what are we going to do with it? I see it in black and white, all these destroyed relationships, all these character defects. What do I do with that? Because my motive here is to get a new attitude and a new relationship with the one who's got all the power and discover what obstacles are in my way. So having done the inventory, I've admitted certain defects. I've ascertained in a rough way what the trouble is, and I've put my finger on the weak items in my personal inventory. Now I want to get rid of these so I can draw closer to that power. And this is going to require some action on my part, which means when I've admitted to God, to another human being, and to myself, the exact nature of my defects, which is that 4th column that we map out from our fears, harms, and resentments, it brings us to the 5th step. Now, discussing one's defects with another person is perhaps difficult. I don't enjoy discussing. I'm going to share my defects with you as I close off my talk today, but I don't enjoy sharing that. I'd much rather have you all believe that I really am an intelligent agent, spearhead of God's ever-advancing creation. But if I skip this vital step, as it says in our instructions, we may not be able to overcome our drinking, our using, or our acting out. So we got to be entirely honest with someone. Entirely honest, no half measures. That should be a slogan in our rooms, no half measures. It dulls me. It baffles me when I see people like when we're out there in our addiction, there's no half measures. We're full on. We want the full effect that we love so much. And yet then I see so many people come in the program and they half measure it. No half measures, entirely honest, rigorously honest with someone if I want to live happily and for a long time. Now, rightly and naturally, we think well before we choose the person or persons. And he's deliberate in that definition, a person or persons. So why would we share with persons? And I'll come to that in a minute. With whom I want to take this intimate, confidential step. Now, I can't reiterate this instruction more. This is a confidential step. The take-home message is don't do step 5 at meetings. And I hear people doing step 5s at meetings. I remember a man confessed at a meeting once here that he had sex with a 13-year-old sex trade worker. And the room ostracized him over it. He went home and blew his brains out over that. And we don't do that. The rooms are not safe to hear intimate personal details of that nature. I remember another guy, I was in a men's meeting, Justin, and there's about 40, 50 men. Now, these are truckers, mechanics, farmers, blue-collar men, all working their big buck. And we're on step 5. And this guy stops us in the middle of our reading and his discussion. He says, I have a confession. So we all stop. He goes, I'm sleeping with someone's wife. Now, every guy in that room, what do you think went through their mind? Is it my wife? This guy was lucky to get out of the room alive. And more tragically, there might have been a husband in that room who's prone to tuning up his wife because he's overtly jealous and insane. And some woman's going to take a beating later on that afternoon. We don't do that. This is an intimate, confidential step. Now, it goes on to say, this process requires confession. We must, of course, will want to go to the properly appointed authority whose duty is to receive it. Can I do off-color jokes here too, Justin? Of course, they're talking here, the tradition that requires confession, they're talking about Catholics, right? And the properly appointed authority would be a priest. But I went to the priest. He didn't want to hear my moral inventory. He wanted an oral inventory, and all I got was a blowjob. I tell you, I just had to throw it out. You got to have a little bit of grit out there. Now, all kidding aside and all bad jokes aside, I was actually speaking at a meeting of about 150 people, and there was dead silence after I delivered that joke. And I go, I'm tapping the mic. Hello, is this thing on? And I look around the room and I go, ooh, bombo. Anyhow, the properly appointed authority. I got to thinking about that. Who is the properly appointed authority for our inventories? Now, I've heard a lot of inventories over the years. Now, I've heard everything. I've heard murder. I've heard rape. I've heard pedophilia. I've heard domestic violence of all sorts, crimes of all sorts. How does one hear that stuff without becoming a garbage can for other people's inventory, or worse yet, putting our lives at risk or their lives at risk? So I got to thinking about this line, whose duty it is to receive it. That means someone who's spiritually fit to hear it. You ever hear an inventory? Sometimes I'll hear an inventory, and if I get too much, I start getting resentful. And now I'm drawing columns and scraping out my resentment because I want to go tune that person up. So who's in the position to receive elements of our story? Now, it says, such parts of our story we tell to someone who will understand yet be unaffected. So I parsed out the confession into several parts. Criminal matters, the properly appointed authority is a lawyer. Now, I was working with a woman who was doing armed robberies. She goes, do you want me to go into the details? I said, absolutely not. You'll take that to a lawyer when you're working out your step 8 and 9. But I will hear your moral inventory in a general way, your selfishness, your self-centeredness, your greed, your bullying, your thieving. We'll talk about that in a general way, but the details of your crime you take to a lawyer. That's the properly appointed authority. I do not I am not immune or in a relationship with someone who confesses crimes to me where they're protected. It is my duty to go to the police and inform them of that particular crime. So I'm very careful about what I hear. There's a great movie, The Sopranos. There's a scene in there where Christopher is a heroin addict, one of the mob crew's members, and he goes to 12 steps and he confesses all his murders to his sponsor. And his sponsor says, I shouldn't have heard those details. And Chris said, you're right, you shouldn't have. And in the episode, he blows the sponsor's brains out. It was really intense. I thought, I don't ever want to be in that situation because I've worked with people who are organized. So I'm very careful about what I hear. Mental emotional issues. Now, I worked with a man who was raped as a 5-year-old boy. Okay. Now, let me ask you this. Does a 5-year-old innocent boy have anything to do with that rape or that molestation? Absolutely not. But there are sponsors out there that will try and construe some inane way of thinking. Well, what was your part in that? That's just absolute rubbish. An innocent does not play a part in that. And he goes, do you want me to go into the details? I said, absolutely not. I am not skilled in psychotherapy. I am not skilled to regress you into childhood trauma and try and piece you back together again so you emerge more whole and more viable. That's what a therapist does, and that's the properly appointed authority. But I will hear your moral inventory as a 48-year-old man using a 43-year-old incident to justify a life of self-deprecation, self-centeredness, victimization, self-pity, self-deprecation. We'll talk about that in a general way, but the details of your trauma should be taken to the therapist. That's for their protection and my protection. Medical matters, hey, nothing good comes from telling your prospect to go off their lithium. Nothing good is going to come from that advice. And I know sponsors that pull that kind of crap. Well, if you really want to be sober, you have to come off your clorazepam, diazepam, parazepam. You're coming off benzos. That's dangerous. A lot of people will commit suicide coming off the happy pills. Now, I'm a big fan in people getting off their meds. But the doctor, the medical doctor, is the properly appointed authority. They understand you clinically. And if you want to get off your medication, talk to your doctor about that and work out a best suggested plan. And if you don't like your doctor's opinion, get a second medical opinion, but get a medical opinion. I am not a medical doctor. And far too many sponsors play junior lawyer, junior therapist, junior doctor in this program. Financial matters. And I'm not talking about owing your mom or your friend, $20 or 20 pounds or whatever. You're enlarged with the revenue service of your country. You're insolvent in credit card debt. You're being squashed by debts. There are properly appointed authorities that allow us to navigate these financial vicissitudes, like the accountant, like the tax lawyer, like the debt counselor. That's their job. They are the properly appointed authority. We're on the same level as the priest. We hear a moral confession, a moral disclosure of inventory, shortcomings, character defects. That's our job, is to receive that, bear witness to that confession before God, and to be assured that they understand how that moral defect is playing out in these resentments, fears, harms, and resentments. Now, two things to watch for when you're hearing a step 5. One, watch out for junkie pride. I meet people, they just want to tell me what badasses they are. They want to get into all this junkie pride about how much they drank, how much they used, all the crazy ass stuff they used to do. That's not what a step 5's about. I don't need to hear all those details. You need to know those details, but I don't need to know them. I just need to know that you understand the character defect that's in play. So watch out for junkie pride. And some sponsors want to hear that stuff, right? They get off on it. Yeah, tell me what happened there. And they get off on it. That's not what it's about. Or you'll get a prospect that wants to shock their sponsor with all the badass stuff they've done. And then you get a sponsor who goes, oh, you think that's bad? Let me tell you what I've done. And you get this one-upsmanship. That's not what it's about. Watch out for junkie pride. And here's the what I find prudent and safe to hearing inventories. I am to give no names or details, nor am I to receive names or details. That keeps me protected. It keeps you protected. All I hear is a description of the moral defect in play. So the instruction is talk to the right person, which could be your sponsor and or a properly appointed authority, depending on the nature of the confession. It's important that we be able to keep a confidence and understand what the newcomer's trying to do, what they're driving at here. I remember a woman called me and says, Cameron, would you hear my step 5? And I said, what's wrong with your sponsor? She said, my sponsor doesn't think I've done enough resentments. I said, well, how many resentments are we talking about? She says, I got 475. 475 resentments listed, and your sponsor doesn't think that's enough? She said, no. He said, I failed to list the resentments I had towards my mother when I was still in her womb. Like, who comes up with that kind of crap? You know, someone comes to you with a step 5. I don't care if it's one item or 20. Let's get those blocks out of the way so that you can draw closer to that power deep down within and easily control your desire to drink, use, or act out. You're playing with their sobriety when you're playing, oh, you're not ready, oh, you haven't done enough work. That's not what step 5 is about. Someone comes to you, they want to confess, you know, you give them properly the instructions and you hear it out. And when we decide who's to hear our story, be it the properly appointed authority or the big book sponsor, we waste no time. We want to do it fast. Let's get it out of the way. And we want to delve into it. We're prepared for a long talk. You know, we want to illuminate every twist of character, every dark cranny of our past. Now, the promises for a well done step 5. If you've been thorough, if you've really brought it, teased out the dark spots into your light and analyzed it. Once we've taken this step, withholding nothing, we are delighted. Oh my God, I've unburdened myself with that sack of crap that I've been carrying around all my life. I can look the world in the eye. I'm not in fear and cowering. Oh, who are they going to find out who I really am? I know who I am. I know my strengths. I know my weaknesses now. I can look the world in the eye, and I can be alone at perfect peace and ease. The yap voices in my head have died down. They're not nagging at me. They're not pestering me. I have a greater peace and quiet, and my fears fall from me, and I begin to feel the nearness of my Creator. Now, I started off in step 2 with faith that there's a power out there, but by step 5, I begin to have an experience with this power. The difference is it's kind of like, you know, a preacher's walking up the aisle of his church and he comes to a pew and there's a man on one side, a woman on the other, and there's 7 children between them. And he says to the man, are these your children? And he says, I believe they are. He then turns to the woman and says, are these your children? She says, I know they are. Is there a difference? He, short of a DNA test, goes on faith that they're his children, but she bore them from her own loins. She knows that they are her children. That's kind of the difference we have with our relationship with the power by the time we delve into our step 5. And the feeling that the drink, using or acting out problems disappeared will come on strong. I got no desire to drink, use, or act out. The thought of polluting my temple is untenable. Oh my God, why would I even do that? No, I recoil like a hot flame. And we feel like we're on the broad highway walking hand in hand with the spirit of the universe. And so this confession of defects, and I'll wrap with this, Justin, is so I do my moral inventory and I look at my column for all the character defects that I've identified in every resentment, every fear, and every harm. And here's my confession. I am an arrogant, I'm hubris, I'm bigoted, I'm misogynist, I'm rude, I'm distrusting and suspicious, I'm selfish and self-seeking. My motives are validation, recognition, center of attention, approval from others. I lie, I exaggerate, I'm intolerant, I'm inconsiderate, I'm lustful, I hate, I procrastinate, I'm impatient, I'm full of fears, fear of not being worthy, fear of rejection, fear of no control, fear of institutional authority. I'm irresponsible, I'm unaccountable, I blame, I enable, I martyr, I bully, I'm very codependent, I'm vulgar, I'm immoral in my thinking, I gossip and vilify others, I'm sarcastic, cynical, take pleasure in another person's misfortune, I'm indiscreet, misanthropic, prejudiced, and I have a lot of unfair biases. Now, that's my resume as an untreated addict. I'm very clear what my weaknesses are now that I have identified them, mapped them out, and confessed them before God in another person. But what's great about understanding our column 4, our character defects, it reveals where the power is. What's God's will for me? What are the spiritual principles that I should strive for that draws me close to that power? So it's to have humility, to know myself, to know who I am, to know my strengths, to know my weaknesses, to be respectful, courteous, polite, to trust my senses, my intuition, to be unselfish, to be helpful to others, to validate others, make others the center of my attention, approve of others, recognize others, to be honest, integral, make restitution when required, to be tolerant, accepting, and tactful, to be generous, intimate, faithful, forgiving and loving, prompt, patient, have faith in God's wisdom and power and the courage to be the man I'm meant to be responsible and accountable for my thoughts, my feelings, my behaviors, to be an independent man so that when I'm engaged in relationships, I can be interdependent, to have purity and kindness, praise the good in others, levity, wisdom, empathy and compassion, discretion, a devotion to humanity, fairness, and justice. And that's my job description under God's employ. And here's another paradox of our program. By doing the inventory, by putting pen to paper and confessing, I can't do that unless I'm living in God's world. The very act of doing inventory and sharing it creates humility. It's about honesty. It's about responsibility. It's about integrity. It's all these elements come into play when we do our inventories. And that's why I'm a big fan of steps 4 and 5. And here's the last paradox. I shared my resume as an untreated addict with you. I've given you my God's job description under God's employment. And here it is. God hires people with the worst resumes to do his work. Now that's paradoxical. So in conclusion, if all I needed to know was my step 4 and 5 and to understand my column 4 defects and my column 5 principles to apply, we'd only have 5 steps. But as we all know, behavioral modification, dialectical behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy doesn't work. And that takes me into seeking a divine intervention, which we do in 6 and 7, where I see the futility, the fatality, and the destructiveness of my character defects. And in step 7, I ask God to intervene, to strip, root, and branch these defects and empower me, give me the agency to live in these spiritual moral principles in all my affairs and have that profound alteration in my reaction to life, which propels me, which rockets me into the 4th dimension. And I'm for that. How about you? God bless. See you on the firing lines of recovery.
Got questions about addiction, recovery, or just life in general? Let's noodle it out together. Grab your big book, a pen, a highlighter, and a notepad, and join Nikki M and me, Justin B, on Rico 12 Noodle It Out with Nikki M. Each episode, we take real-life questions, ours, yours, and those from the recovery community, and dig deep into the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous to find real, practical solutions. So, if you're ready to do the work and apply the solution, tune in to Noodle It Out with Nikki M, streaming now on your favorite podcast platform. Awesome. Thank you so much, Cameron. I really appreciate the energy and the enthusiasm that you share your recovery with us with. Everybody in the live audience, if you have a question for Cameron, type it in the chat. If you want to remain anonymous, in other words, if you don't want me to read your first name when I ask the question, just say anonymous or send me the direct message of that. Cameron, I've written down a few questions for you. And one of them is one that I look at and I'm like, man, I'm just too nice. I'm too much of a people pleaser. How do you, when somebody starts sharing their step 5 with you and they start going too far, it's like, okay, I don't want to hear this. How do you jump in and say, hey, shut your mouth. I don't want to hear this. The details need to go somewhere else. I couldn't even jump in and say, hey, Cameron, be careful with your off-color jokes, so.
Yes. Well, I got to keep remembering there's a lot of saints and virgins in the 12-step rooms. There's another off-color joke.
Yeah.
Usually, before I hear a step 4 or 5 or a step 5, I go over the instructions pretty succinctly with the prospect. so they understand what it is I want to hear and what I do not want to hear. I remember someone confessed a murder to me, and he just mentioned that. I said, that's all I need to know. And then we'll delve into it. I'll clarify. Let's look at the question of murder. You see, false pride is a sliding scale. If I slide on false pride in self-deprecation, self-loathing, the ultimate expression is suicide. If I diminish myself to that point, but if I exaggerate myself in relation to you and I slide the scale along arrogance, the ultimate form of arrogance is where I diminish you to the point that you have no value and I can take your life. And then we delve into it.
Yeah, thank you for that. All right, we have a question from our live audience. Sherry says, how do you know when you've done enough inventory for a step 5? What's your guidelines for that, Cameron?
Two things. One is I go for the big stuff. When I think of someone and I'm chopping them up and wrapping them up in butcher paper and figuring out how I'm going to distribute them in the garbage collection of the coming week, that's someone I'm going to be putting down on my step 4 inventory and analyzing what's going on there. If I think of someone that I wince with guilt, shame, embarrassment over the harm I've done, that's something I'm putting down. If I'm being overtly attacked with fear, like when COVID hit and the lockdowns came, my fear of institutional authority went through the roof. I did a lot of inventories to manage that fear and to look at my part in playing that fear out. Actually, a great thing came out of that. I read the book, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, who spent 6 years at Auschwitz facing the proposition of a gas chamber every day of his life, living on 8 ounces of bread for 6 years. A really phenomenal story, and really helped to shift my awareness around the fear of institutional authority, which kept the homicide rates in Toronto down. So I go for the big stuff, and I know I've done enough inventory, Sherry, because the promises of step 5 come to bear. I feel delighted. I can be alone at perfect peace and ease. I can face the world. That's when I know I've done a good job on my inventory and enough. Eventually, all of it gets taken care of, but I go for the big ones first because I'm going to tease out most of the defects and those big resentments, those big fears, and those big harms. And by sharing them and mapping them out and seeing how futile and fatal and destructive they are, I can get some real traction and move forward to draw close to that power.
Thank you.
Beautiful thing. Yeah, thank you for that. All right. Next question comes from our live audience. This is an anonymous listener. The person says, and I've put this in the chat, it's a fairly long question, Cameron, so if you want to read along, you can. I worked the steps more than once and have been sponsoring continuously. I have a few resentments that I think about daily, and it makes me think I did not do a proper 4 and 5 with my sponsor. How do I do it properly to truly let it go when I was really harmed and feel stuck over the hurt? Does a better 4 and 5 need to be done, or a better 6 and 7, or just prayer? What would it look like to be free from those resentments and pain?
That's a great question. Listen, I really dislike police officers. They are thugs for the state. And it goes to hatred. It really does. And I have done lots of inventories on government and police and those types of things. And I chiseled away at them. Sometimes it takes more than one inventory. If you've ever watched the movie The Shack, where the protagonist is confronting his resentment over the man that raped and murdered his little girl, and he's trying to find forgiveness. He does the forgiveness, and then he says, but I'm still angry. And he says, yeah, you're probably going to have to do it about 1,000 times, but you'll get there. So every time I find myself drawing into hatred and vilifying police officers, I do an inventory. I remember my sponsor saying lots of 4s and 5s, lots of 8s and 9s. And when I do an inventory, each time I see a little more clearly how futile, how fatal and destructive it is. And by doing my inventory, I rub my nose in my own shit. Bad Cameron, bad Cameron, bad Cameron, right? And eventually I start making some spiritual progress. I hope that answers that. So lots of 4s and 5s, lots of 8s and 9s.
All right, so let me ask you a little bit about this. So step 10 is, I watch for those resentments and whatever else, the fears to come up. And let's take the police that we've talked about here as an example. And when they do, I ask God to remove it. I talk to somebody, I make amends if I need to, and I turn my thoughts resolutely to someone I can help. What's the difference between doing an in the moment 10 and a 4 and 5 that you're talking about? Lots of 4s and 5s and 8s and 9s.
That's a good question too. Now, I handle my inventory in one of three ways, or sometimes it's a progression. Sometimes I'll recognize a bigoted thought or a vilifying thought or some form of hatred might enter my brain. And I recognize it and I go, come on, Karen, let it go. And it vanishes like a fart in the wind. Right. So that's all I need to do. I'm not even going to look at that later on at night when I review my day. But let's say this incident has happened a couple times in the day. I'm really annoyed. I'm kind of pissed and I can't seem to let it go. And then I'll pause and pray, God, please remove this vilifying thinking. Please intervene and remove hatred. Help me cleave to acceptance and forgiveness and love. Move me forward. Give me the strength and courage to let it go. And usually when I take 10, 20 seconds or a minute to pause and pray, that's all that's needed. And I can release it. But let's say something went on and it hammered me and I got pissed and I said things or may have done something I shouldn't have. Now I'm drawing columns. Now I'm scraping the inventory like barnacles from my haul. Now I'm on the phone confessing my wrongdoings, my trespassing and transgressions with another person. And I'm making amends on what I've said or did. So those are the kind of three approaches I take depending on the graveness and the gravity of the resentment, fear, or harm that I'm tackling at that moment in my day. And that's the difference. And I incorporate that as my 10, but I also use that in conjunction with my 4 and 5.
Hey, Spearheads, if you're looking to dive deeper into the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous with people who live the solution, then you won't want to miss RICO 12 Big Book Roundtable. Join David G., Nikki M., and me, the moderator Justin B., 3 recovered addicts from multiple fellowships, as we break down the big book line by line. In each 30-minute episode, we share our experience, strength, and hope in a real, raw, and practical roundtable discussion. So, if you are ready to learn and apply what you learn, tune in to RICO 12 Big Book Roundtable on your favorite podcast platform. Yeah, that's good. Thank you for kind of delineating those different ways of approaching it. I appreciate that. Just in the last, 3 or 4 days, I took a step 5 with one of my sponsees. And it was such a cool experience. It was the first time I'd ever done it. He's new in program and just working his way through it. And afterwards, we talked about these promises, the step 5 promises. And I loved as I shared this one, we can, where is it here? I'm looking at it. We can look the world in the eye. And as he shared this, his whole countenance changed. And I said, you can look the world in the eye now, can't you? And he goes, I think I can. So talk to me a little bit more about your experience with these promises, especially this one of looking the world in the eye after decades or longer of shame and putting your nose in the ground everywhere you go.
Well, I don't experience the shame as much anymore because I've done so much 8 and 9 work to clean up the wreckage of my past and make right the wrongs I've done. And so I find God forgives and God gives me the power to shoulder the burdens of my past. Like, for example, I was violent as an alcoholic addict and I terrorized my family. I terrorized my children, and I can't give my children their childhood back. I took it from them. My daughter ended up doing therapy over it. And so when I work my program, like, I bend over backwards to be the best father I can be to my 40-year-old daughter and my 42-year-old son. And I got a really nice relationship with both of them now. So the shame and the guilt and the remorse dissipates. Like, we're going to know a new freedom before we're halfway through on the 8s and 9s. As far as the The other question is in inventory. Like I still, I'll say this tongue in cheek. I murder at least 3 or 4 people every day in my head. And that's not what really. And you've been working a program for 22 years. Yeah, I can get pretty crazy. And so, humility is a powerful, powerful perspective to hold. I know my strengths. I know what I'm good at. I know where I'm strong. And I know where I'm weak. I know where the flesh is weak. And I have a program that allows me to compensate for those weaknesses. When the world isn't going my way and I'm pissed off, I've got the discipline of step 3. I am here to do God's will, not Cameron's will. I'm here to be of maximum service to God and my fellow human beings. If I've got resentments going on that are threatening to disrupt my peace and serenity, I've got the discipline of 4 and 5. And 6 and 7. And if I've done harm to other people, I've got 8 and 9. And if I feel my connection to God is weak or broken, I have the discipline of prayer and meditation, whereby I can talk to God and listen and discern the direction I'm getting. And if I'm being overtly selfish, I've got step 12, turn my thoughts to someone I can be helpful to. Often when people call me up and they're angry or they go, they got something going on in their inventory or their process, I go, hey, take 2 big books, 1 newcomer, call me in the morning. Right. So that's how I approach that. And I like to think that I'm making spiritual progress. And there are times when I feel like I've taken 3 steps forward and 5 steps backwards. But I have a program to compensate, to navigate. It's like when I fly from Toronto to Heathrow, it's a 7-hour flight. And it always arrives on destination and on time, even though the plane, which a lot of you may not know, is off course 90% of the time. Yet it always arrives on time and on destination. How is that possible? Because the pilot and the co-pilot are always conferring and conversing with one another, checking their gauges, their altitude, their headwind, their tail speeds, their speed, their ground speed. They're conferring with ground radar, and they're always correcting their course so they arrive on time. That's the way I work my program. I'm always, am I in column 4 or I'm in column 5, correcting my course. I check myself before I wreck myself.
Well, that's good advice. Thank you, Cameron. Got another question. This is from Leslie from our live audience. Leslie says, how do you handle it if a sponsee does come to you with hundreds of lines in the inventory? As sponsors, is it a helpful thing really to listen to them all? And I was going to ask a similar question to this, because I think the 3rd or 4th step 5 I ever took, it was an 8 or 9 hour process. It was forever. So tell me a little bit about your experience and thoughts on that.
God, I'd rather masturbate with a handful of broken glass than listen to a 9-hour inventory. God, isn't that an awful analogy? 69-year-old man talking this way. It's just terrible. That's a good question. Often, what I have learned in doing inventories is that if I go for the big ones, I am going to tease out 95 to 99% of the character defects I need to be cognizant of. And I don't need to hear all of it. It's like Wally P. says in his book, Back to Basics. Sometimes it takes only a few incidents to indicate what character defects block the newcomer from an intimate 2-way relationship with the one who has all the power. So the big stuff is always what I hear. Most step 5s that I hear are under 2 hours. Most of the time I hear maybe anywhere from 3 to maybe a dozen items. I remember one person called me up and says, she had like an opus. And she says, you have to hear my entire inventory. It's going to take 30, 40 hours to get through it all. I go, you're not that fucking important. I'm not going to listen to that. I'm not your garbage can or your therapist for all that crap. Let's talk about the big ones. Let's look at the really big stuff. The fact that I had a resentment towards my grade 2 teacher because she put me in the corner for talking in class when I shouldn't have, and I was so embarrassed. That isn't what's causing me to poke needles in my arms. I can deal with that. I got a program for dealing with that, but that's not really the resentment that's at play. It's usually the more current stuff and the bigger ones that are causing all the problems for me.
Yeah.
I hope that explains it.
Yeah, I think it does. I think it does. You talked just now and you mentioned it earlier. I can't be someone else's garbage can. As someone's sponsor, yes, let's see, what does my sponsor say? Save your mess for your sponsor and the message for the meetings, yes, I need to hear your mess, but how do I do that and set those expectations in such a way that the mess isn't, I'm not a garbage can. I'm just somebody that can pass it through.
Well, another thing I when I'm on step 5 with someone and they're sharing with me and they're going through their inventory, a couple things happen. One is they may not see a particular character defect that's in play. Like codependence is something we all experience. As soon as I'm in resentment, I'm in a codependent mode. I'm blaming you for the way I think, feel, or behave, or I'm blaming you for not doing what I want you to do. And my battle cry is, I need you to change so I can feel okay about myself. And a lot of people miss that distinction. And I will point that out in the context of their share. So sometimes, because it takes two to see one. And so I'll point out blind spots when I'm working with others. What was the rest of your? I'm sorry, Justin. And the other part of your question was
the other part was, how do I just let those things pass through rather than carry them as a trash can? Yeah.
Yeah. So I asked them to explain how the defect works in their life, how it's playing out. I don't need to get into the details of the story, because as they get more and more detailed about the context of their story, I can be triggered. Like when I'm hearing about a woman being beaten by an abusive, rotten husband, and I'm hearing too much of that, I start getting angry. And then I start saying things, would you like me to arrange an accident to happen for your husband? And that's not good. I'm not serious, but, it's not good to even think like that. It just takes me off the game. So, stick to the character. What's your part in this problem? Let's look at the resentment and the character defect. Let's look at how your codependence is coming into play. Are you playing the martyr? Are you being bullying? Are you being enabling? Are you avoiding? Let's look at the politics of the wheat that come out in the codependent relationship. Or, how does your hatred play out? My hatred plays out in like, I can really relate to the love and fantasy addicts. I'm not a love and fantasy addict, but I can relate to them and they can relate to me, because my fantasies are horrific. Like I'm giving Hannibal Lecter tips on how to do his work, So, I don't want to go down that path. So, I get mindful when I'm navigating my day. I'm very mindful, not only what I put into my body, like what foods I'm eating or what I'm drinking, or, I'm also very mindful what I'm putting into my mind, what I'm watching on TV. I really do not want to go down another YouTube rabbit hole or a Facebook scroll spree and waste hours and hours of time trying to satisfy some weird and arcane fantasy that I need some kind of completion on, which I'm never going to get. And so I'm trying to always be mindful. How am I keeping my tempo? Am I on purpose? Is what I'm doing of maximum service to God and my fellow human beings? And if I can answer yes, it is, then I'm always on course. And I use that in the step 4 and 5 too. Like I said, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole with them, wallow with them with their character defects. What's the old adage? If you sleep with dogs, you pick up fleas.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, please.
You let off your share talking about how suicide is just so high in the rooms, and untreated addicts are among the highest, if not the highest, people in the suicide community here. People who die of suicide. I have a close friend in recovery who this last year, it appears, took his own life. And it was really, really hard. For me and for a lot of people in my community. Talk to me a little bit about how I don't even know where to go with this question, but what do we need to do about this? Is there anything that can be done?
God, I can be flippant and serious on this one. There's two ways to get to God in this program. One's in the book and one's in a box. I like the box. That way I don't have to work with them and I can watch bad reruns on Netflix. Isn't that an awful answer? Suicide. You know, when you can't live with your addiction anymore. It's too painful. It's too unmanageable. I can't go on. I can't live like this anymore. But I have no idea how to live without it. And in sobriety, I sit there in meeting after meeting, getting more resentful, more restless, more irritable, more discontented. So that unmanageability inside my head is so unbearable that suicide seems the only way out. And I've seen it happen 9 times. Seven hung themselves, one asphyxiated themselves with a bag over their head, and the other jumped off the viaduct onto oncoming traffic. It's awful. And it's so unnecessary because the joy and the freedom and the magic and the love and the acceptance that comes by just following these very simple steps. I think part of it comes from just better instruction to the newcomer as to what we're doing, because the 12-step methodology is simply a process that allows us to broker a relationship with the divine spirit, with the divine consciousness within ourselves. And in connecting to that, the bare minimum of our program is the ability to easily control our addictive pattern. But the magic of it, as that plays out in all our relationships with our families and our friends and our careers, it just keeps giving and giving. I have a good relationship with my wife for 36 years now. A great relationship with my kids. My liver went back to normal. I went back to university, did a degree in medical anthropology and religions. I've created groups. I've started areas. I've traveled all over the world. I did the workshop. I wrote the workbook. You know, it's like, it is an incredible life living this program.
Hey, Rico 12 Spearheads. If our recovery resources have helped you, please consider a donation. Your financial support, as well as your word of mouth support, keeps Rico 12 running and reaching the man who is still sick. Donate today at rico12.com/support or check the show notes for PayPal and Venmo links. Every contribution helps carry the message. Thanks for being a Rico 12 Spearhead. No, thank you for sharing that and for the motivation behind it. In fact, I want to give you just a second here. Excuse me. Talk about the workbook and the workshop that you do.
You know, I learned, I used to do NLP back in the 90s when I was doing personal development seminars. And there was this concept called modeling. So when I came into the program, I modeled my life after 2 people, Bill Wilson and the Apostle Paul. Both of those men proselytized a message of God to their worlds. Now, with Bill, what did Bill do in the first 4 years of his sobriety? He found Dr. Bob. They worked with 100 alcoholics, and they wrote the big book. So I just modeled good behavior. I worked with 100 people and carrying the message of the big book. I wrote the workbook, or Bill wrote the book, but I just kind of synthesized it into a simpler, easier to absorb methodology, and I created the workshop. And the proof has been in the works, right? So the workbook is just a synthesis of, in the first 164 pages of the big book, there's about 30 pages of instructions. The rest of those other 134 pages is commentary, and it's good commentary. You should be aware of it. But the actual instruction on how to do a step that draws us closer to this power within ourselves is about 30 pages. And I was able to share it in a way that demystified the program and gave them a real easy to understand and grasp workable methodology that allows them to broker that relationship and recover. And I've seen lots of miracles. I've seen lots of tragedies too, but I've seen lots of miracles, Justin, in that approach. Just making a very, like Dr. Bob said to Phil, don't louse it up. Keep it simple, right?
Yeah. And I've put that link to the workbook workshop information here in the chat, and it'll be in the show notes of the podcast also, if anybody's interested in that. It's a fantastic, definitely worth. So here's what I tell my sponsees. I work with a lot of people whose Sundays are a day that they typically worship. I say, this is definitely worth ditching out on church a couple times a year to attend. And I definitely follow that instruction also. So anyways, Cameron, do you have any final words of wisdom before we start closing this up?
Well, our whole model of fellowship is based on the church. Our meetings are like churches, they're like congregations. Sponsors are like the elders of the program, the elders. We have our scripture, which is the big book of AA or whatever literature you're working with. The analogy's there. I feel like I'm always in church. Although my wife, who's a Baptist, might disagree on that.
Thus the tux that you wear, you get dressed up for church that you're always in. Is that how that works?
My favorite way to center with God, because that step 10 promise, we're in a position of neutrality, safe and protected. And our program allows us to don the mantle of God so that we're proacting on God's business rather than reacting on my petty fears and designs. But my favorite way to bring my being, my mind and body and spirit to center is to sing with my wife, to sing for an hour to God with the congregation. I just get so centered on that approach.
That's really cool. Cameron, we have one last question that just came in that I think is pretty good, and I think we can answer it fairly quickly. And I'm assuming that I understand what this question is. This is from D. What happens when resentments are spoken to our sponsor? And I think that what that means when my sponsor's on my list of resentments. How do I do that with my sponsor?
Gee, I've made a lot of people's lists on resentments. If the sponsor is really hearing just the character defects, it'll be about the prospect rather than the sponsor. And we don't want to hear although they got to explain column 2 too. That's depends on the situation, I think, Justin. Boy, that's a little more difficult to ask, because I remember someone called me up and said, Cameron, I need to make an amend to you. And I said, I didn't even know you had harmed me. And she said, well, I had a lot of resentment towards you. And then she proceeded to share her column 2 with me of all the reasons she resented me. And before she's halfway through, I'm slamming the phone down after calling her very nasty names. And now I'm drawing columns and working out my resentments. So, I would take that kind of case by case. Some people get really angry at me. Most of the prospects I work with just fire me. I've never fired anyone, but I've been fired thousands of times.
Yeah. Got a clarifying on this, and then we'll wrap it up here real quick. The person at D meant, I mean, the higher power effect when resentments are spoken, like the magic of step 5. I feel heavy with resentments and don't see how they'll be gone. How does putting a voice to it make that work?
That's a good question. Well, the confession of the character defect that fuel, here's what I ask. When someone shares a resentment with me, I go, okay, we know it's selfish and self-seeking. It's all about you. So let's look at the motive. What keeps your hands around their throat? What's the motive? Well, I want them to love me. I want them to accept me. I want them to pay me back. I want them to admit their wrongdoing. And then I go, well, is that very likely? Are they likely to do that? No, they're never going to do that. So would you agree that's a futile, fatal, and destructive self-seeking motive to cleave to? And we start to chisel away at it, right? And what's the fear that drives it? Well, the fear is I'm not lovable, I'm not acceptable, I'm not good enough. And that drives your need for acceptance and for them to admit their wrongs and to make things right. And then the other character defects come into play. I get irresponsible, I blame them, and then I get impatient, and I get dishonest, and I get suspicious. And then we look at, like rubbing our nose in it, how futile, fatal, and destructive that strategy is. And why do we want to get rid of the resentment? And here's the real reason. I get restless, irritable, discontented, bored, depressed, anxious. That activates the liar. The liar says, screw this. We need a drink. We need a drug. We need to act out in our addiction pattern. And we got no defense against that. And I succumb to the desire. And now I'm in real trouble.
No, this is good. Thank you for taking this time, Cameron. Really powerful share on step 5 and these different things that we've talked about. It's been very helpful for me. I hope for a lot of other people out there too. If you have additional questions that you'd like to ask, please join our WhatsApp community, post them there, and we as a community can answer them. And if you'd like to get in contact with Cameron, reach out through me, reach out through the link that I put in the chat on the 12 Steps 4 Hours website. Reach out through me at the email rico12pod@gmail.com. We'll make sure that can happen. All right, next week, come back for step 6. Michael S. will return. He's spoken with us several times before, and he'll be our speaker on step 6 next week. So come back for that. Let's close out this meeting today. Cameron's going to launch us out of here with, I believe, the we version of the Serenity Prayer, correct?
And I'll leave you with it. I'm not really big on affirmations, but this is a good one. I love you and I accept you even though I don't understand you. I love myself and I accept myself even though I don't understand myself. I love the we version of the Serenity Prayer because it signifies what we do together that we can't do alone, to have the courage to accept the things I can change, which is anything inside myself, and the ability to accept that which I cannot change, which is anything outside myself, as our Al-Anon and Coda brothers can attest to. So I love the we version of the Serenity Prayer in that meditation and discernment. So on that note, God, grant us the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, the courage to change the things we can, and the wisdom to know the difference. God bless. See you on the firing lines of recovery.
Thank you so much, Cameron. Remember, everybody, there is one who has all power. That one is God. May you find God now. Keep coming back, and when you do, come all the way in, sit all the way down. Let's trudge this road of happy destiny together. Work it. You are worth it.
There was a man put his hand by the side of his mouth, and he wanted to scream, but the sound never came out. So he reached for the bottle to wash the pain away, 'cause what he wanted so badly was to live a different way. And all of his problems and all of his pain filled up the puddle and rose with the rain. His ship kept on sinking to the bottom of the lake. For certain that he was just a fake, just a fake. Was a man put his hand by the side of his mouth, and he wanted to share, but only lies ever came out. So he reached for the needle to numb the pain inside. And the truth that he yearned for shriveled up and died. And all of his problems, all of his pain sight of his mouth as he read from the book, only truth spilled out. So he reached for a power to help him through the night. 'Cause what lives in the darkness dies in the light. Yeah, what lives in the darkness dies